Well, good evening. I'm just so pleased to see so many of you here tonight. I know it was very cold and wet and blustery earlier, but to see you here is a real testament to your concern for the wider public interest and leadership that fosters the greater good. And so we're really so pleased and so honoured that you can join us tonight. I'd like to just echo Tim's words and give a special vote of thanks to Steve and Margaret Graham, for who were responsible for this project. So Steve and Margaret approached us in 2017 with the view of thinking about what can we do to foster a world that's sort of worth living in. What can we do to foster an environment that we can bequeath to our future generations? How can we, in other words, be good ancestors? And this was a starting point for us to think about, well, what can we do? What can we do as researchers who deal with evidence and data to provide a strong evidentiary base for this important work, this important intergenerational work? So, Steve, thank you very much for this gift and for starting this whole grand enterprise of ours. It's, as you'll see tonight, I think, it's really taken on a life of its own. It grew from a small idea about what leadership for the good is, no small thing, into what we are now very proud of, an elaborate, comprehensive, systematic study of leadership for the good in Australia across all institutions. We're really delighted, and starting with you and Margaret here, so thank you very much. So tonight's going to be a bit of a three-parter. I'm going to set the scene for the next 15 minutes or so and provide some context, the context within which leadership for the good can be situated. And once the context has been established, then I'll then pass over to ALI co-founder Vlad Demsar to introduce the new dashboard, the new leadership model that underpins our work, and to show you just how we can use this insight, use this data to create new insights into what institutions can do to foster the good in their own way. As you'll see, leadership for the good differs according from institution to institution in important but subtle ways. So Vlad will give you a good sense of that and a very practical insight about how we can use this data to improve things in the here and now for future generations. And the third part, and the part that I'm really looking forward to, is a panel discussion with four of our colleagues who have been living and breathing leadership for years in a variety of sectors, often, actually, mostly across sectors. So I'll leave Melissa to introduce our special guests, but we're really delighted to have you tonight and feel very honoured that you have agreed to come and speak to us about this. So thank you, Chris, Bruce, Sarah, and Steve. Now for some context. It's long-winded and so forth, so I'll use the script if you don't mind. But this should give you a fairly good sense, I hope, of just the state we're in and why it's an important thing for us to address leadership in the way that we're doing. So as revealed by countless news stories and reports into trust, integrity and transparency, Australia's social institutions are often seen as acting at odds with the public interest. Accompanying this is a pervasive sense among the public that they are not well served by their institutions or the authorities who effectively lead them. In response to the question, who speaks for and protects the public interest? Very few of those institutions appear to be fit for purpose. As shown over the last 3 years by the Australian Leadership Index, although some institutions are held in low esteem, such as government, very few institutions are regarded positively. Notable exceptions, and this won't surprise you, are charities and public sector institutions like hospitals that expressly serve the public interest. Now, although not all institutions are created for the purpose of serving the public interest, and business is the obvious example of this, Australians nevertheless expect institutions across all sectors to be alive to the public interest and to behave in ways that either help it or, at worst, don't harm it. I hasten to add, though, that it's important not to catastrophize about the state of the public interest in Australia. For example, despite Australia's misgivings about government, it is also true that Australia is richly endowed with a raft of government-funded public services that provide us with a very high quality of life by international standards. As noted by Ian Macaulay and Miriam Lyons in their study of government and the public good, we drive on public roads and we use public transport. We send our children to school, and regardless of whether the schools are public or private, much of the funding comes from government. We use publicly funded health services. We benefit from the regulatory services that underpin our confidence that the food we eat is safe to consume. And when we buy a house, we rely on government agencies to confirm that our title is secure. In disasters, emergency services invariably come to our aid. However, it's equally important not to be complacent about the state of the public interest. Institutionally, there is a marked loss of faith in the integrity of institutions and a widespread sense that those who lead them are often more concerned with the pursuit of material self-interest than the wider public interest. This loss of faith in institutional integrity is particularly striking with respect to government, which has been corrosive of the institutional foundations of democracy. Socially and culturally, to pick one example, Australia's reckoning with its own past is a work in progress, and our efforts towards reconciliation still have a long way to go. Ecologically and globally, society's activities have pushed climate change, biodiversity loss, and land use beyond safe planetary boundaries. As recently argued by Julian Cribb, we now face a host of interlocking megathreats, such as climate change, global poisoning, and pandemic disease, all of which raise questions of survival, not merely of thriving or flourishing that so occupy us presently. Too often, we take common pool resources and public goods for granted, and only think about them when they break down or when they collapse. Consider, for example, the recent Australian energy crisis where, after almost a quarter of a century of letting the market operate freely, the energy regulator imposed total national control of the grid for the first time in its history. Notably, in response to this, the head of the Australian industry group, Ines Willox, noted that, quote, energy users need confidence that all market participants are working towards the common good, end quote. For decades now, terms like the common good and its synonyms, the public good and greater good, have scarcely entered the national discourse. And where they have been used, it is mostly in the context of crisis and disaster. We think that it's high time to start to think and talk more explicitly and deeply about the common good, as well as leadership for the good and the processes through which we can search for the common good. But how should we think about the common good and the search for the good? Despite all that's been written on the topic over centuries, millennia really, the precise meaning of the topic of the common good remains elusive. And although the concept seems familiar and commonplace, it is difficult to define or articulate in a precise or comprehensive way. Indeed, as observed by the philosopher Hans Sluger, the diverse conceptions of the good, such as liberty, justice, security, to name but three, and the variety of local, tribal, national, global communities for which the good is sought, militates against the identification of a single determinate good. Consistent with this, the common good, and especially the search for the good, presents a host of dilemmas, tensions and paradoxes that must be apprehended and addressed if we are to find common ground, discover shared interests, and imagine a common future. Most prominent among these is the tension between the individual and the collective, which includes groups, organisations, communities, and society itself. According to Donaldson Forsyth and Crystal Hoyt, the tension between the individual and the collective is the, quote, master problem of social life, and is the tension to which many problems of modern life can ultimately be traced. Thus, the common good is neither simple nor obvious, but rather complex, multidimensional, and paradoxical. Construed in this way, the common good is better understood as an umbrella term for several uneasily interlocking conditions, principles, processes, and systems that underpin survival and flourishing. Similarly, leadership for the common good is not reducible to any single approach to leadership, such as transformative, ethical, servant, or adaptive leadership, although such approaches may find expression in the practice of leadership for the greater good. Furthermore, leadership for the common good does not occur at any single level, such as teams, organisations, communities, sectors, or nations, but across several interlocking levels. Thus, like the common good, leadership for the common good is complex, multi-dimensional, and as we are increasingly learning about leadership in general, paradoxical. Because the actions of all institutions in all sectors have a bearing upon the common good, leadership for the good transcends institutional boundaries. Thus, it is also multi-sectoral and germane to the institutional ecosystem as a whole, and not any particular sector or institution. However, the forms of leadership for the good and societal expectations of leadership for the good are likely to vary from sector to sector and from institution to institution. In the context of business, for example, leadership for the common good may resemble what Thomas Muck and Nicola Pless have called the extended stakeholder view of responsible leadership, which calls on business leaders to demonstrate a strong focus on the external community and embark on actions to develop the community around the business. This, however, is neither simple nor straightforward, requiring business leaders and their organisations to grapple with social and commercial logics, which often pull in different directions. This tension between institutional logics is something that even the most dedicated social enterprises struggle with. The complexities of business leadership for the good is something that one of tonight's guest speakers, Sarah Downey of the Shared Value Project, will be able to illuminate more fully. In the context of government and the public sector, leadership for the good may resemble what Stephen Brooks and Keith Grint call public leadership, which is a form of collective leadership that seeks to promote, influence and deliver improved public value, a useful, if somewhat fuzzy, concept that is related to the common good. The hard-won lessons about the challenges of public leadership is something that our guests Chris Cotter and Bruce Thompson will also be able to illuminate more fully this evening. Finally, in complex shared power contexts in which no single institution or set of institutions is in charge, as it were, leadership must be enacted across several interlocking levels using a raft of different leadership practices. In these contexts, leadership for the good is by necessity a collective effort that must be shared among diverse actors, groups and institutions. This is especially the case in the context of complex social challenges, in which people and groups are deeply stuck, not least because they share profoundly different worldviews about the nature of these challenges and how to address them. This insight has particular relevance to the search for the common good today, where we are learning, once again, about the distinct contours of libertarian, liberal, conservative, neo-Marxist and postmodern conceptions of and social arrangements for the good. This is the world of what Dave Snowden terms complex contexts, characterized by flux and many competing ideas and unknown unknowns. These contexts call on leaders to create environments and experiments that allow new patterns and new understandings to emerge. In these contexts, the line between leadership and transformative facilitation begins to blur. Our final guest, Steve Atkinson of Rios Partners, is well placed to shed more light on these challenges and the types of transformative facilitation required to help groups and people get unstuck. In summary, in the same way that the common good is not reducible to a single good, leadership for the good is not reducible to any single style, approach or sensibility. It is complex, multidimensional, multi-sectoral and nuanced. This conception underpins our model of institutional leadership for the good. It is to the Australian Leadership Index, our model of leadership for the good and our new interactive dashboard that we now turn. Thanks very much.